So we begin with chapter 1, which is usually a pretty good place to begin. And chapter 1 gives us the setting and then introduces us to a few of the key characters. And so, verse 1, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, you never want to call your baby Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Notice verse 2. Who delivered the people of Judah into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar? The Lord our God. This was Judah's judgment because of their protracted sin. Very often, God judges through the very thing that we choose instead of Him. It's almost like a parent who discovers their 10-year-old has been smoking and then makes them smoke the whole box at one time until they turn green. That's, I think, what God does sometimes. So He hands us over to our idols. In Hosea 4:17, it says, Ephraim, which is a reference to the northern kingdom of Israel, is joined to idols. Leave him alone. In other words, let's see what those idols do for you. Or He hands us over to our out-of-control desires. We see that in Romans 1:24. God gave them over to their sinful desires of their hearts. Or He hands us over to the lies we are determined to believe. Very sobering verse in 2 Thessalonians 2:10 and 11. Because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved. For this reason, God sends them a powerful delusion so that they will believe the lie. The people of Judah had thought they could sin without consequence. And they could live with a little bit of God and a little bit of their own worldly desires and a little bit of the idolatry that they'd learned from the kingdoms around them. But eventually, after multiple warnings, God hands them over to those very nations. And what Daniel reminds us of is that God is not absent from the story just because there's a crisis. He's as much a part of this story as He's part of the story of Psalm 23. Daniel shows us that God is not this domesticated figure who guarantees our safety and comfort no matter what the circumstances. God is still holy. He's still jealous. He's still just. And we can't play devotion with Him. God had warned the divided kingdom of Israel and Judah about their stubborn disobedience. And He told them, you can't have one form of justice for the rich and the strong and another for the weak and the vulnerable. You can't oppress and exploit people during the week and then come with your songs on the Sabbath. You can't be corrupt and immoral and not wonder what that must do to God's witness among the nations. God is saying, when we divorce godliness from how we treat others, it's the first step towards idolatry. We can't divorce our relationship with God from our relationship with others, and think that doesn't lead us towards idolatry. And so God delivers them into the hands of the Babylonians. Not because the Babylonians were any better. In fact, they excelled at many of the things that God judged Judah for. Idolatry, adultery, sorcery, cruelty, violent warfare, and witchcraft. They were so bad that later on in the New Testament, Paul uses Babylon as a symbol or structure to represent the Antichrist. He could have used Sodom, Gomorrah, Nineveh, maybe even Rome, but he chooses Babylon. And we're going to see how God works through and for those who are faithful to him right in that environment. So now, chapter 1 introduces to us some of the leading characters. Continuing at verse 3. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of the court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. I'm going to come back to that. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. Skip to verse 6. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, to Abednego. And as the series develops, we're going to see how these men become a community of friendship and faith that enables them to be effective and steadfast in this alien world in which they're in. But let's go back to verse 3. I find this fascinating. Some of the Israelites were from the royal family and the nobility. You know what stands out to me here? Because here is Judah exiled into Babylon for their rampant idolatry, corruption, and disobedience. And yet, right from within their ranks, there are still men of spiritual integrity and stature like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It highlights something that I've always believed, that none of us ever have an excuse for not taking accountability for our own spiritual development and growth. Daniel and his friends could have lived evil lives and just blamed it on the king and his example. They could have lowered their standards and just attributed it to the society in which they had grown up. But no, they chose to honor God regardless. And then they get to live in Babylon, immersed in a culture that was both powerful, sophisticated, and deeply secular compared to what they had been brought up in their past. And it makes us think, Because how do we as Christians remain faithful to God in our world, where we are surrounded by values and practices and pressures that oppose our Christian values? What we'll see is that while Daniel lived in Babylon, Babylon never lived in Daniel. We too live in a Babylon of type. A world that often tries to marginalize our faith, or at least put it on a par with every other religion and ism. And it elevates its values of self, power, compromise, or tolerance. Do we give up? Do we fight fire with fire? Do we rebel? Or do we behave like robots? How did Daniel handle those things? And so my first point this morning is the test of identity. Let's see what happens when the Israelites, these 4 men in particular, what they do when they're faced with the test of their identity. And the test of identity is a clever ploy on Nebuchadnezzar's part to assimilate the exiles into Babylon culture and erase their distinctiveness. And so we go back to halfway through verse 4, where Ashpenaz, the king's chief of staff, was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. The test of identity came to Daniel and his friends in at least 3 ways. Their names were changed, their education was reshaped, and their diet was imposed. First, their names. If there is anything that is going to mess with a person's sense of identity, it's touching the name by which they are called every day of their lives. Daniel's name meant God is my judge, or God is my right ruler. And he's given the name in Babylon of Belshazzar, which means Bel protects my life. You can't get much more divergent than that. Bel was the chief Babylonian god, similar to who Zeus was to the Greeks. That was Bel. And what is Daniel's response? Does he kick up a fuss? Does he play deaf until someone calls him by the right name, Daniel? No. He doesn't even let it faze him. The second thing that changes is their education. They were taught the language and history of the Babylonians. And again, from what we read, Daniel never had an issue. Even though the history that he would have associated with would have been, he would have seen was where God was creator. But in a land where you, I guess, serve Baal, that history is written by the victors. And so he would have been subjected to teaching that Baal was the creator God. and stuff like that, which would fly in the face of an Israelite. Our culture also seeks to redefine our identities, to assimilate us within the story of our age. The onslaught of media, consumerism, and relativism all take their place in an assault against biblical belief. If I go to Home Affairs and I say that I'm Marc Hemmens, they'll go, huh? If I go to Home Affairs, I'm 6502025, our ID number. We don't even think of it as being strange. It's just normal. And we accept it because we know who we are. We don't define ourselves by a number. What about education? If you go to schools or varsity, the theory of evolution is no longer taught as a theory, it is taught as fact. Do we now take our children out of schools and homeschool them? I'm not sure. Daniel didn't go and start the first Creationists Unite party. He didn't go and picket in the streets. He just went to class. He just attended. Because quietly, confidently, he knew that he belonged to the only true God. Culture can try and rename us in many ways. The world tries and sells us the belief that if we're successful, we can earn the identity of being wealthy. If we are of worth or of value, our identity can take on a certain image in society. And if we talk about truth, we will be expected to understand that truth is relative. No wonder Paul said in Romans 12, verse 1, "Do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." For Daniel, faithfulness begins with remembering who we are in God. And that requires us to resolve that our identity is first and foremost in Him. Which leads me to the second point. The test of compromise, or the test of conviction spoken positively. Verse 8, "But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way." Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, "I'm afraid of my lord, the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you lot look worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the God whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink." This is so appropriate as we go into a week of fasting. Right here is Daniel fast. "Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the god took away their choice food and wine, and they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. Firstly, it must be said that scholars are uncertain about Daniel's objection to the royal food. Because he wasn't asking for Levitical kosher food, because Jews ate meat, just not pork. And they drank wine. So this wasn't to fit in with his Levitical beliefs. And all Babylonian food, including the fruit and vegetables, would have been devoted to their Babylonian gods, and therefore would have been considered unclean for a Jew. Daniel would have had to starve to stay kosher in the Babylonian palace. So while we can't say for sure, it seems as if Daniel and his friends, that their diet was an attempt not to normalize a lifestyle of indulgence and privilege at the risk of forgetting all those who were still in need and distress around them. Some of our biggest temptations concern food and shelter, clothing and recreation. And there can come a point when legitimate needs can become illegitimate gods. And when that happens, people start looking at those who can't even satisfy their legitimate needs with judgment. They may say things like, "Oh, must be a poverty spirit." Or they dismiss them altogether and disregard the poor. Daniel and his friend didn't want to fall into either one of those traps. So Daniel engages Babylon. He takes a new name, studies their literature, but he draws a line where he might compromise his beliefs and dishonor God. For him, faithfulness is not withdrawal, but it's wise engagement. Notice also that in Daniel's stand, he still shows respect and honor for Ashpenaz, the king's official. Daniel understands the position that this man is in. He knew his head was in the game, quite literally. Okay, he'd lose it if there was trouble if they started looking poorly. And so Daniel puts forward a 10-day progress plan for no other reason than to honor this Babylonian. How's that? Do we show the same kind of respect to our officials? I think of people in government departments, who are way down the food chain, just doing their job. They're not the decision makers, yet they're often the ones who cop attitude from us, the public. How can we show respect and honor to them while we take a stand for the things that we believe are right and important to what we believe? Faithfulness today often means discerning where to say yes and where to say no, and just being wise when we choose to be faithful, not only with what we do, but also with the way that we do it. Who we're impacting, who we're influencing. So, point number 3, the reward of faithfulness. Verse 17. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, so this is now 3 years later, the chief official presents them to Nebuchadnezzar. And the king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus, probably about another 66 years. When faced by culture wars ourselves, we are often presented with a false dilemma: withdraw or compromise. But Daniel did neither. He did not withdraw, and he did not compromise. And he wasn't afraid of the diverse world that was around him. He firmly believed that God was his true king, and he could be trusted to help him navigate and discern faithfully the world around him. And so Daniel and his friends reap the reward of engagement. In every matter of wisdom and understanding, the king found them 10 times better. Faithfulness in small things prepares us for greater responsibility. God honors us when we put our trust in him. Do you know what that means? It means that God is sovereign even in Babylon. And God is still sovereign even in our secular world. And he honors those who put their trust in him in it. Worship team, why don't you come join me? Faithfulness in a secular world is not about retreat, but about resilient identity, courageous conviction, and a trust in God's sovereignty. It means that God's people, you and I, can thrive in exile without losing our soul. Daniel calls us to faithfully trust God's sovereignty, even in our own Babylon. Daniel served under several pagan kings, as we will see. He accepted a pagan education and even a pagan name. And we know that he prayed for those kings that he served. He counseled them and faithfully engaged without compromise and pointed them towards God. We're going to see that too. This series is going to challenge us. And it's going to challenge us to see that even when we have rulers who in their pride and their cruelty can act beastly, we are still called to a discerning and faithful engagement designed according to our Lord. We don't compromise and defile ourselves. We don't run away in fear and withdraw. We engage. Because, as Jeremiah said, if this city prospers, so will we.